Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, where you learn about what's happening in the greater East Bay. I am your host, Jared Asch. Today is Wednesday, November 13th, 2024. This is a week and a day after Election Day, and we're going to talk about some analysis of the November election and what happened here in California and in the national trends. I'm joined by a special guest, Professor Nolan Higdon from Cal State East Bay. I appreciate you joining me, Professor.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Tell the audience a little bit about your background and credentials.
I'm a instructor and I teach courses in media studies and history and education. And I've been a writer and researcher on the same subjects for over a decade now. And I keep a online newsletter through my Substack that applies media literacy to what's going on in news media. Folks can get a better idea of what to trust and what not to trust in the media narratives.
And that'll play through this election. The obvious question here is there's been a lot of writing in the news media about the Democrats' losses, and the red tidal wave that they predicted in 2022 finally was here. What do you make of the post-election sort of criticism of the Democrats and what led to that red wave?
I've been a mix of both pleased and upset with what I've seen by the Democrats in terms of the reaction to the outcome of this election. I've been upset by the fact that a lot of Democrats seem to be falling back in the old 2016 game where they try and find different pockets of voters to blame. They can't blame all whites now because there were upticks in voters of color for Trump. Some folks are just blaming men in general. Some folks are blaming, of course, the fake news, disinformation. Other folks are saying that the information didn't get out there. And obviously there's racism and sexism in the electorate. That's undeniable. It's also undeniable that Trump and his campaign played into that. But I think Democrats have these scapegoats that they choose to ignore the fact that when push comes to shove, we have two parties in this country, and one of the parties did not do enough to get enough voters to turn out for them to win an election. I think the Democrats have to wrestle with that. They refused to wrestle with it in 2016. They're forced to do it here in 2024. And I think one of the wrong messages a lot of Democratic consultants are getting is, oh, we just shouldn't run a woman again. They're saying, if we ran a white man, we would have won. I think that's the exact wrong message to take. Women win in elections all over this country. Barack Obama won a lot of the districts that Trump won. I don't think it was necessarily even the candidate in this situation. I think the Democrats set her up for failure. Biden shouldn't have entered the race. They should have had a primary where Harris could have strengthened her message, could have built some relationship, could have tested out some things, could have built a campaign. Instead, she had to do all those things while running a campaign in 100 days against someone who's basically been campaigning since 2015. That's a part that upset me. The part that has given me some inspiration, though, I've been looking at some of the numbers. A lot of Democratic leaning media outlets are seeing huge drops in their audiences, like MSNBC and the Washington Post. I hope that part of that is audiences realizing that these news outlets duped them. They only showed the positive sides of the Harris campaign, the giant rallies, and they talked about joy and good vibes and the huge donations and the celebrities. But they ignored all the traditional signs that the campaign was in trouble. So a lot of the Democratic voters were caught off guard. And the fact that some of them are now turning away from this media system in an effort to get access to facts and unvarnished truth is a positive sign.
Let's look at California. One of the things that we're seeing is what other people are calling a rightward tilt in California. Which could be argued one way or another, but Trump did better than Biden did in the state. And you saw some criminal justice things passed. In fact, Trump improved in maybe about a dozen counties in the state where they switched from blue to red. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to why that occurred? A California senator running for president?
I think that the main takeaway, and this is true nationally, but also really true in the Bay Area, is there's a general rejection of the status quo. People have been frustrated with the politics and economics as normal in this country since the late 1990s. They brought in George W. Bush to be a compassionate conservative. He was going to be a different conservative. Then Obama was promising hope and change. And then they voted in Donald Trump was the outsider, and they had Bernie Sanders the outsider in the primary that same year. The electorate has been clamoring for change. Biden and the Democrats really only got back in because of COVID. COVID just dropped Trump's approvals enough to lose to Biden by 40,000 votes in a handful of key states. And then after another 4 years of Biden, people were reminded why they wanted change. They wanted something new. I think this is less about the country going conservative. I don't think everybody became Reagan's dream overnight. I think what happened here was people wanted change, and they saw that in the Republicans and Donald Trump because the Democrats are in power nationally as well as dominating the state. Republicans are endangered species in this state. It's really difficult to blame Republicans. Democrats took the blame. I think you see that with the recalls of Pamela Price, the Alameda DA, Sheng Tao, the mayor of Oakland, or Lyndon Breed's defeat. Those are all signs of people being really frustrated with the establishment. One of the things I want to point out is versus left used to have a very strong meaning, but that meaning has increasingly been blurred since the 1970s. On economic issues, the left and right have mostly been the same for the last 50 years. They disagree on some culture issues, obviously, like same-sex marriage, abortion, trans issues. They have a disagreement on foreign policy. Neocons tend to want more military intervention. Democrats lean more on negotiation and diplomacy. But other than that, they're really the same parties. Right now, we're seeing them both find their identity. And I think the Republicans have gone in a direction where they're championing working class rhetoric. They're attacking the quote unquote establishment as coming down on free speech and hurting the economy. Democrats are trying to find a message, but it's not really the traditional left versus right. A better way to describe it is team blue versus team red, because there's a lot of progressive leftists who have left the Democratic Party. Some have become politically homeless. Others have joined Trump. And a lot of Republicans have left because of Trump. Some have gone to the Democrats. Some have become politically homeless. The red versus blue is a better way to understand these parties than traditional liberalism or conservatism in America.
Why do you think nationally turnout was down compared to 2020? Significantly by about 15 million votes. Why do you think so many people stayed home?
I think Donald Trump's success is really dependent upon enthusiasm, and he's able to get people enthusiastic about turning out to vote for him. The Democrats had a similar enthusiasm against Trump during Trump's first term. I think they used a lot of that political capital in 2020 to convince people democracy's on the ballot. This guy's a fascist. We have to defeat him. You can't keep going back to democracies on the ballot every time. Eventually, folks are going to say, what are you doing as a leader to make the conditions better where people don't even consider voting for this guy you call a fascist? And I think Democrats failed to do that. Some people could never stomach voting for Trump, even though they were frustrated with the Democrats. So they simply stayed home. They weren't enthusiastic to get out. Harris, who knows? If Harris had another 150 days, maybe she would have inspired more voters to get out, but we'll never know because the party set her up to come in late in the game.
Let's talk a little bit more about those recalls you mentioned. London Breed not officially recalled in San Francisco, but in a sense recalled. People said enough. And you saw that same trend in Alameda. What's the big takeaway? You talked about just change in general. What else are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask about what's seen on the ground. In the academic world, we spend a lot of time reading and analyzing text, but due to the work I do, I get to travel a lot. Traveling in places like airports or local restaurants, you really learn a lot more about America than you ever do looking at these big data sets behind a screen. And what's interesting traveling the country, I'm one of those people who tries never to bring up politics when I travel. I do it for a job. I don't want to do it in my small talk and conversation. But I was astounded how many times, just consistently, when I was out in public, I would hear people complaining about Democrats, hear people complain about Biden. I saw very few signs where driving around, I saw tons of Trump signs, Trump shirts. You really got a taste around the country that people were frustrated with Democratic Party leadership. But I think it's worth reminding folks where this 4 years of Democrat dominance began. And I think you can't tell that story without COVID. During COVID, a lot of us were at home. We were on lockdowns. We were behind our screens. And we could find like-minded people online about certain views we had regarding policy and electoral politics. And I think it gave a lot of people a incorrect sense of where the country was at on some of these issues. And some of these politicians took risks. Some of these big ticket progressive items like in criminal justice reform, reducing sentences, things like that, They thought they had a mandate. But after about 4 years of this stuff, we saw people start to reject it. Nellie Bowles wrote a great book on this, where I think it was titled something like The Morning After the Revolution. And she's a reporter in the Bay Area talking about how she's seen this dramatic shift. When everybody was at home behind their screens, they championed all these policies, and it seemed like this giant progressive wave. Once the lockdown stopped and people got back into the flow of things, people's opinions dramatically changed about a lot of these laws and pieces of legislation. And it was just within a 4-year period, we saw this quick switch. And you would expect it maybe nationally in some places, but in a place like California, this is a bastion of progressivism. So if it can't take a stronghold here, that doesn't bode well for the rest of the country in some of these progressive policies. I think there's always been a cognitive dissonance between a lot of the Democratic Party voters in California and the people they purport to represent. It's very obvious. We've seen huge social movements. There's a lot of communities of color that want police reform. That's undoubtable, and that goes back decades. Look at some of the journalism and news footage around the crack epidemic in the 1990s, and you'll see the Black community rightly complaining about abuse by police, but they still want safety in their streets. They still do want a police force that does protect them. And you can go back and look at folks like Charlie Rangel talking about this in the 80s and 90s. A lot of white progressives who don't live in those communities, who live in privileged communities, vote for these types of reforms thinking they're in solidarity with these communities, but it's not necessarily what these communities want. And I think that too often happens where progressives think they're speaking for a vulnerable community, but really they're not. And they're sometimes advocating for policy that community doesn't want. And I think that seems to be the case that happened with some of these reforms.
Yeah, and that's actually been a conversation with a lot of my political friends from all over the country. Is it people in the ivory tower on the left coast starting to dictate to everybody what these reforms should be? But that's not necessarily what people want. And you saw that with transgender rights across the.
Yeah, I think there's some debate about that. Earlier, we talked about the Democrats trying to understand this loss. One of the worst arguments I've heard is one that you mentioned that you heard somebody else say, which is that it was all about culture war issues. If you look at the Harris campaign, one thing I'll say was quite shocking about it. She was going to be the first woman of color president, which would have been huge. She rarely talked about it, and
Right.
she rarely talked about trans issues. She rarely talked about race and gender issues. There's a lot of critiques, and maybe some people say she would have done better if she talked about those issues, but there's a lot of Republicans and conservatives now saying that's what the Democrats get. They talked about these issues and people don't like those issues. I'm just looking at the landscape and not seeing it. I don't think that they did talk about those issues. She has talked about those issues previously, and maybe that previous campaigning hurt her. But in my estimation, that wasn't the critical factor in this campaign. That's usually an attack on Democrats if they go too far woke or left. I think it goes back to some of the things we were talking about with the economy, with the perceived crime wave and things like that. I think those prove to be more pivotal factors. That's what Democrats, I think, are going to need to explain. How can we create safer streets without empowering a criminal justice force that's killing unarmed Black people? How can we create an economy where we have a thriving middle class and we eradicate things like housing insecurity while upsetting our donors, things like that? I think those are some of the questions Democrats are now wrestling with, and the nation in general, but the state of California in particular.
Okay, and let's bring that back into California. Those trends are similar when you look at the ballot initiatives, where people stood on things like rent control and criminal justice reform. Can you talk a little bit about your insights on some of the propositions?
Yeah, I think the propositions reflect this shift, but you can still see signs of things that California voters will always vote for. California voters are definitely liberal on most cultural issues, and I think you saw that on Amendment number 3 that repealed the same-sex marriage ban. That's still really popular here in this state. There's still support for regulating certain industries to some degree. I think you saw that with California Measure 34, which had some regulation on certain healthcare entities. But when it comes to things like labor and some spending initiatives, there seems to be a division in the electorate. The electorate doesn't look like it's going to vote to raise minimum wage. That went down in defeat. They still want to keep a high vote total necessary to approve any bonds. They still want to keep a ban on rent control. So economically, we see a centrist or center-right approach from voters, with the exception of authorizing bonds for school facilities. Californians typically believe in education. I think you can see that by our thriving systems, our 113 community colleges, CSU, UCs, private colleges. So that's no surprise there. I think the one that stands out to me, and this has been a shift in California, if there is a shift toward perhaps Trumpism or MAGAism in this state, folks will recall in 2020, voters here voted down some of the propositions for affirmative action in California. That was in 2020. Voters voted that down. And now here in 2024, there was an opportunity to ban slavery and involuntary servitude within the state. This was targeted primarily at prisoners, and California voters did not vote to prohibit that. They still believed in that idea of prison labor. And I think you couple that with 4 years ago with affirmative action, that does seem to be the type of voting that's more in line with kind of the MAGA. There's signs of the MAGA shift. There's also signs of traditional California liberalism as we look at these proposition outcomes.
Interesting. What would you, going forward, 26, 28 ballot initiatives, governor's race, what are some takeaways from today in California that you would apply to the 26 potential props and statewide, regional housing bonds, transportation bonds regionally are talked about? What are some thoughts ahead on that?
Depends what kind of politician you are. If you want to play into where people are and perhaps their cynicism, you could continue to advocate for prison labor. You could advocate for reduction in taxes while simultaneously running on things that are culture war winners in the state, like access to reproductive rights or protection for minority communities. Or some folks are also leaders. Maybe there are leaders in the state who are politicians that think California needs to move in a different direction. And that would take going out there, convincing people on the stump speech that we need to vote for taxes to pay for X, Y, and Z. We need to solve the housing crisis. That's going to take some economic sacrifice. Are you someone who wants to follow the trends, represent, and float on by? Or are you someone who's a leader who wants to shift where voters are at? I think that's going to be ultimately where the questions that politicians are asking.
If you were advising MTC on a 9 county or a 5 county Bay Area transportation tax, and what would you think? And before you say that, I think there's been a ton of local taxes that passed this cycle. Rio Vista, Benicia, Sassoon, San Ramon. I want to say maybe Pleasanton in the East Bay, and probably a dozen others have passed local taxes. How would you look at this regional transportation tax advising MTC? What do you think they should be paying attention to?
Like I said, I think voters in California, more than most states, are willing to pay for taxes on things that they think are for like the common good or necessary, like education. Transportation has had a mixed history in California. So folks who are trying to procure funding for transportation, my advice would be really do your research on where voters are at. You will find districts that, without even thinking, will vote yes on taxes. These are folks who commute or have grown up here who wish there was better transportation. But you'll also encounter and should be ready for counter propaganda campaigns. People are going to try and convince voters not to vote for this, maybe because they don't want to raise taxes, maybe because they don't want transportation going through their neighborhoods and disrupting the view or the sound, or maybe they'll scare people with that criminals or poor people are going to come to your neighborhood if this transportation goes through here. If I was trying to advocate for this transportation, I'd be ready for those counter propaganda campaigns, have answers for those, also try and keep voters in the know of why this is necessary, why it's good, and keep that conversation going. Don't rest on your laurels that this thing's going to work because voters have voted for tax in the past. Time and time again, we've seen, go back and look at the history of BART or something with the way the South Bay rejected that. There's this long history. So you don't want to take for granted that Bay Areites vote for taxes no matter what.
There was a housing bond that MTC had looked at and didn't even make it to the ballot at the last minute for this cycle for the 9 county Bay Area because they knew they didn't have support. You saw that statewide, the statewide housing bond was losing as well, despite everybody saying in California, homelessness is one of the bigger issues. What are some of your takeaways?
I'm sympathetic to all sides of this argument. On the one side, I think it's absolutely embarrassing in a nation as rich as the United States, not to mention a state as wealthy as California, that we have so many people going without food, going without housing, victims of all sorts of crime because they don't have a house to protect themselves or money to protect themselves. I think it's atrocious, and I think it's incumbent upon us as a nation and a state to do something about that. On the other side, though, I also recognize that there's a lot of factors outside of the state of California that are causing this outcome. And we can try and house the folks that are here. And as I mentioned, I think that's the right thing to do. But unless we solve those larger systemic problems, you're going to continuously get more and more people coming to a place like California, which is fine. We welcome everyone. That's the great part of the state. But we have infrastructure issues with that. How are we going to build the infrastructure around it? What are these larger push factors? Since the 90s, we've globalized trade and allowed companies to go elsewhere, but workers cannot go elsewhere and take their like union protections or pension or high pay with them. So for folks who want to get those good paying jobs, those pensions, that security, they have to go to where the work centers are. And if you're outside of the US is a great place to be as compared to say like most of Central and South America. So folks come here. When you're in the United States, whether you're a US citizen or not, there's few centers that have huge economic opportunity, the Bay Area being one of them. I think that the problem we need to solve as a nation is we need to not incentivize people to be leaving areas with creating these sort of trade agreements that create horrible conditions for workers within California. We can't have a handful of areas where everybody migrates to work. We need to have opportunity for folks across the nation and in the place where they live so they can work within their community and not have to leave unless they want to.
About voter trends for this cycle. We saw a shift, and a lot has been reported about particularly young men and women in Black and Latino communities going for Trump in a way we've never seen. Maybe on the Latino side, I think I saw some numbers that said in 2004 for his reelection, George W. Bush did well. But we saw this trend. What does that shift mean for California? Do you know how big it was? What should our politicians be paying attention to?
I think it's early to tell how big it is. I think we were talking a moment ago about 2 years, 4 years from now. Let's see what Trump does. If Trump's a disaster for a year from now, this could be the greatest thing for the Democratic Party ever. We could be writing the obituary for Republicans in 2 or 4 years. Who knows what it means in that sense? But if these trends persist, the Democrats have a real problem. They're losing the working class. They're starting to shed off base support amongst people of color and young people, as you mentioned. White women, looks like, will will barely go for Trump. The Democrats are shrinking. They're becoming a party of rich, credentialed people, professionals, and a handful of urban centers. That's not really sustainable. But in a state like California, this was eventually going to happen. This happens in any state where one party dominates. If you dominate for a long time, which the Democrats basically have since the late 90s, you can't blame another party when things go wrong, and they inevitably will. That party ends up getting blamed, and you start to see a little more red come into the area. I think we're in one of those moments where folks are frustrated from a national perspective, and I think this speaks to the young people in particular. There's upteen examples over the last 8 years of the embarrassments of Donald Trump, whether it be the sexism, racism, claiming Frederick Douglass was alive, calling fine people on both sides with Charlottesville, etc. Young people noticed in the last year or two how embarrassing it was for the Democrats to run someone who clearly had cognitive problems, and then the media lied to them about it, called him ageist when they brought it up. Then when he has this horrible debate appearance, everyone flips and admits there's cognitive problems and he shouldn't run. I think for a lot of young people, that's probably a jarring thing to see, that this party was willing to lie and keep this guy in power when they're worried about critical issues in their lives. This is the person at the helm. They're clearly concerned about things like Gaza. And it's not even necessarily they just disagree with him, which they do, but they also don't have confidence the guy actually knows what he's doing or what's going on. I think that also plays a pivotal role in how voters turned out in this election, is they just had lack of faith in the person. And he was going in like the podcast space, and the UFC seemed a lot in touch with what these folks were doing. And Trump has a unique ability to simplify everything, right? He speaks to all the real problems that folks are experiencing, and then he blames it all on immigrants. A real simple explanation that I think folks are attracted to, where Democrats are in this abstract world of power and social justice and the BIPOC community, and using these phrases that are just over a lot of people's heads. I think that also helped Trump as well.
To what you said about 2020, it was a different campaign. Biden didn't have to campaign the same way he would have for reelection. Trump's campaign had energy and a vibe. Biden did not. I could understand where younger people felt that way about the age. And even though Trump isn't much younger, he did appear much different. The second takeaway I have there, which leads into a question, is on immigration.
Yeah, I think it's a semi-difficult question to answer, but I think one of the things that makes it difficult is a piece of what's passed as conventional wisdom, but I think we're finding is intellectually bankrupt. But we've talked about it. There's clearly racism on the right and xenophobia on the right regarding immigration, right? Trump tried to say that the Mexicans coming here were all rapists and criminals, which is absolutely false. When he lives in California, teaches these folks, lives with these folks in the community, I can tell you that's total nonsense. But there's also a more muted racism on the left that I notice a lot, which is liberals feel comfortable talking about communities without any evidence. They often talk about the Latino community saying things like, yeah, immigration, that's the number one issue. He said something negative about immigrants that's going to work against Trump and the Latino community. Actually, Latinos are like any other voter. There's a diversity of conservatives and liberals. So they have a mix of priorities. Some might put gender issues over economics. Some might put immigration over race. They're a mixed community. And if you live amongst folks from that community, which I do, you know that it's a mix within the community of how folks feel about things like immigration, how they feel about the immigration rhetoric. There are some folks in the Latino community who I know personally who really look down and talk out against undocumented immigrants. I think it's a mix. Some folks put their working class interests perhaps ahead of the immigration status of folks who might share their racial identity. That helps explain part of it. But I think just to take it away from asking this question about Latinos, I think about this in the electorate all the time. Democrats are rightly pointing out that racism and sexism played a role in this election, and it's undeniable. I think there's a huge part of this electorate that have a problem with women in positions of power. And so they are looking down on shame with these people who wouldn't vote for Harris. But there's some people who didn't vote for Harris who look down on Democrat voters with shame, arguing that they're running a genocide in Gaza. Where people put their priorities affects how they vote. And I think some folks put immigration at a different priority. The biggest polluter in the United States is the Pentagon. You hear this huge climate change movement of young people, but then young people vote for Democrats. But both Democrats and Republicans vote to fund the biggest polluter, which is the Pentagon. Does that mean those young people don't care about climate change? No, it means it's on their priority list somewhere. There's something else above it that leads them to vote for Democrats. I think that's the critical way we need to start analyzing voters. Too much of our media system makes us think of identity groups as one-trick voters, right? Like women are only going to vote for a woman, and then we find out white women overwhelmingly voted for Trump in 2016. People have different priorities.
Sounds like you're talking about a need to really micro-target voters, particularly at the local level here in the Bay Area, versus trying to just group everybody together.
Exactly. Voters are complex. It's so complex. Roughly about three-fourths of Americans supported access to abortion, but roughly 45 to 50% said they were against abortion. People are complicated. They can be against something, but still believe people have access to it. You got to meet voters where they're at. And we talk about huge swaths of the population. The black vote, it's 13% of the population. There's a diversity of views within that vote. We do a disservice to those groups when we speak like that. And I think it leads politicians to lose because they put a script on a huge population of people and then find out that script is inaccurate.
Let's dive in a little bit more about the media. You talked in the beginning about a trend where Democrats are actually, you're seeing subscribers leave things like MSNBC and the Washington Post, which have catered to Democrats. How do you think the media overall covered this? Let's first start with Trump's lies. A lot can be said whether you like him or not, that he has said a lot of misleading things, like your comment about the Mexicans. How do you think the media did? Let's grade them.
I think the media did poorly to the voters. My evidence for that is the fact that you can look at everything in Google News or Apple News, and it's about Democrats being shocked at the outcome of the race. If there's that level of shock, that means voters weren't well informed about what was going to happen. So I think that's a sign of failure for the media. I heard some reporters say that one of the biggest searches in the days before the election was, did Biden drop out? If that's true, that would be another failure of the media system, that people don't know who one of the candidates are, but also speaks to the problem with having a candidate run in 100 days. People getting caught off guard, that's a problem. The other issue, like Trump's lies, for example, the media is in a spot where they basically can't win. they've reported on Trump's lies for 8 years, and he's more popular now than he's ever been. What do? If you keep reporting on his lies, it seems like it's not landing. People just roll their eyes. Here's the media going after Trump again. Yes, he said something racist. We got it. It's just not landing. But the flip side is if you only show Trump's lies on Democratic leaning media to those audiences and you only show positives about Harris, they have a twisted view of the world. They deride Trump for a lot of the horrible things he's done, in many cases rightfully, but they think Harris is doing well as a result of how disgusting this person is. And then they find out there's this whole electorate that they just haven't been made known about. They haven't heard from, they haven't seen. And so they end up stunned on election day. And I think that's a dramatic failure. I think the media should have taken some of these questions more seriously, particularly like Trump not conceding the last election. I think nobody should have ever asked the Harris campaign when she was going to concede the election. And instead, they should have been asking Trump, is he going to concede the last one so she can concede this one? I think that would have been a much better step in that sense. I also think they should have been much harder on the Democratic Party. A year ago or 2 years ago, they should have been hammering this Biden cognitive ability thing and say, we're not talking about age. Ageism is something different. Cognitive ability is something very specific. I think they should have focused on that. I think they should have taken the uncommitted voters a lot more seriously. That caught a lot of Democrats off guard, that these folks were not only not voting for Harris, some were voting for Trump. If they had more balanced coverage on Gaza and more balanced coverage on the protests, maybe they would have saw that coming as well. And not having a primary. I think they really should have hammered that you can't speak out of both sides of your mouth. You can't say we're the party of democracy and democracy's on the ballot, but we're going to install whatever candidate we want because we screwed up trying to protect another candidate. The media was complicit in that. You had people like Joe Scarborough lying. You had people like Whoopi Goldberg saying, I don't care if Biden poops his pants, I want him to be the candidate. So I think the media did a very poor job. And I think that's why so many Democrats are in a state of shock. And I think that's why so many Democrats are now looking for alternative media sources, because they realize that they're just really out of touch with where the world is due to their media system.
And let's go to the Republican side. Fox News probably showing the opposite, right? All one-sided towards Trump, making Harris look bad. Talk a little bit about that side.
Yeah, so the same problem on the right. Trump's whatever faux pas or hate speech are always passed off or explained in some way. Even his failures are justified. Like when he lost that debate, I had all the conservative networks on. As soon as they all came out of the debate, they said, those moderators, it was the moderators and Harris against Trump. So they all told the same story, basically saying Trump would have won, but he was outnumbered. This is just total nonsense. But the difference is the Trump campaign had a secret weapon that liberals did not. And this is something I've focused on, which is Trump recognized that audiences are not in traditional media. Audiences are in new media. They're in what we're doing right now. We're podcasting. There's a huge shift. It's not just young people. It's people of all ages have gravitated toward this space. So Trump's going on Theo Vaughn and he's going on Joe Rogan and he's appearing at UFC and he's with Logan Paul. The traditional media, like always, is laughing at him. But it was genius. He's reaching way more voters. That's where a lot of those young voters are. That's where some of the male voters are. We call those podcasts I just mentioned the manosphere. And that includes the men of color. And Trump was able to turn those out. I think the legacy media did a pretty terrible job. I was impressed with the new media. I think it was soft interviews for Trump. But you did force Trump to speak for 2-3 hours. And you do learn a lot more about the candidates there versus 10-minute sound bites. Progressives have a thriving new media space that's like the manosphere in terms of digital media, its popularity, its audiences that speak to leftists. But the difference is they're antagonistic toward the Democratic Party and the Democrats are antagonistic toward them. Democrats think that this party is too burning, too squad and keeps sinking them nationally. The progressive media think the Democrats are too obsessed with trying to get Republicans like Liz Cheney to vote Democrat that they ignore progressives on the left. Regardless where you stand on that, the point being, Harris and the Democrats don't have that same digital space that welcomes them and amplifies their message where Trump did. And so Trump tapped into that. One of the things I can say about your question about how do I rate the media, I think this was a huge election for new media. The podcasting space really stuck its flag in the ground. I would even go as far as to say from 2028 on forward, parties are going to, one of the things they're going to consider when they find a nominee is, can this person podcast? Can this person sit down for a 3-hour interview? If you're a type of politician who needs all your talking points written out for you and you need to stay on message, your era is dying. The folks who can come off authentic, and speak for a long time. I think that's where the future of the presidency is going to go.
Interesting. As a follow-up to that, I read an article that Harris had a lot of celebrity endorsements. Their campaign maybe didn't engage that podcast space in those long interviews at all, but they did hire and pay a lot of influencers. Somebody sent me something. There was at least 100 people on Instagram that they paid $50,000 or more to endorse Harris and talk about the campaign. That apparently had no
impact. We also got a leak this week that when Biden was staying in the race, internal polling showed that he was going to lose to 400 electoral votes. Even though the Democrats lost, this may have been less of a loss due to that spending. But I think the celebrity endorsements, I know there's some debate right now about how much, if anything, she paid celebrities like Oprah and Katy Perry. But those with the influencers, yeah, those are huge in getting your message out there. But the catch is you have to have a message. And I think even if you don't agree with Trump's policies, and this was true in 2016, so I feel like I'm in Groundhog Day here. I could list the policies he ran on, like what I expect if he's president of the United States. Harris was a little more difficult. She went for this vague thing of like joy and good vibes. And so occasionally she'd say something like price gouging, and then she'd walk it back. Where Trump was really clear, he's going to get rid of the Department of Education, right? He's going to do this mass deportation plan when he gets into office. He's going to tweak the tariffs. It was very clear what to expect from a Trump presidency. I think Harris, and this goes back to the shortened campaign and not being able to primary, I don't think Harris had a message or a policy plan, and she didn't have the time to articulate and communicate it. Influencers are out there demeaning Trump and trying to amplify the idea of Harris versus the policy or message of Harris.
So, where do people who want real news in a moderate way to tell that whole picture go, other than this podcast on the Capstone Conversation?
First of all, if you're not on the Capstone Conversations, you don't know what's going on. Get on the Capstone Conversations. And then after that, well, I always encourage folks to have a diversity of media. So I do think it's important to occasionally check in with the cable news, Fox, MSNBC, CNNs of the world, but don't let them dominate your life or your day. They are, corporate and political propaganda at some level. There are some journalists who work there as well. Legacy papers are important. Even if you disagree with the Times, WAPO, Wall Street Journal, and Forbes, it's good to read those because it gives you an idea of what those in power are reading. You can get some idea of what those folks are thinking. If you want to be in touch with what the public is thinking and what people are on the ground are doing, I do think the podcast space is a great space for that. Even if it's not a podcast that has guests that are average working people, you can see what average working people are tuning into. The fact that Rogan has sometimes 7 million views on his interviews, there's something there. He's doing something that the public likes. So I think it's worth paying attention to. And also in some of these podcast spaces, you can find different questions. Like I like the Bad Faith podcast. She does a great job. Brianna Joy Gray, she's probably one of my favorite podcasters, right behind you. She likes to ask critical questions, and she engages in discussion with people she disagrees with in a constructive way. You can hear different viewpoints without arguing. A great news show that I recommend, and I'm not affiliated with these people, I'm advertising, by the way. The Breaking Points podcast is really good. Every morning, they have a populist right figure and a populist left figure, and they go through major news stories with a goal of trying to talk to working average people. And they give you a right and left side. They don't argue like the old crossfire. They show where they agree and where they disagree. And it can be helpful in getting a diversity of opinion and content. So when you engage with people who are just MSNBC or Fox viewers, you can have some counter messaging. You can have some questions to ask them and also give a different perspective so you guys can learn together. I think there's plenty of media out there. Unfortunately, cable news media has really become a wasteland. And I would encourage people to abandon that regardless of where they go.
I'm going to come back with two final California questions here.
Right.
First, a poll in the New York Times shows 50% of Californians would accept Harris as a nominee for governor. What are your thoughts on that? I can't imagine she's made up a mind yet, but what are your thoughts on the poll right now and her jumping back into California politics?
Ultimately, it's be up to her and her family. They've been through a lot. We see the interviews and travel and exhaustion, but also they get death threats and security and all that. So it's a lot on a family, and it's up to her. But I would say politically, I think Harris is ripe for a position like that. She never really caught on nationally. We saw that in the 2020 campaign and 2024. But in California, she's always been pretty popular. And I think the national campaign probably improved her popularity here within the state. So coming back here and representing the state could be great. And look at Joe Biden. You never say never. She could be governor here, and in 20, 30 years, she could be running for president again. Who knows? The presidents keep getting older. So Harris, so the sky's the limit for you.
And any final thoughts on some of the Bay Area races here, or any takeaways on the Bay Area elections that we hadn't hit on yet?
I would say to those who are concerned out there, who are Democrats or liberals, look, the state's still pretty much dominated by Democrats. It took a little bit of a beating in the election on some propositions in some counties, but the Democrats still control this state. If history is past, Trump will probably alienate some of those who voted for him, and there'll be an opportunity to redefine the Democratic Party and possibly reassert the level of dominance they had previously. So lick your wounds, do some soul searching, but if you want to come back, there's plenty of space if folks take the right action with the right message.
Thank you for being here, Professor Nolan Higdon from Cal State East Bay. I appreciate you joining us and giving us your thoughts on this election.
Thank you so much.
Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.